In the world of faith, some stories shine with hope, while others echo with silence and sorrow. One of the most haunting tales comes from the final days of a man once celebrated as a giant among preachers. This is He Was Left to Die Alone. Bishop Eddie Long's wife finally tells all. Through the quiet but powerful voice of his wife, Vanessa Long, we hear not the polished public tribute, but the raw, painful truth of a man who faced his last days surrounded not by love and loyalty, but by abandonment and betrayal. At the height of his power, Bishop Eddie Long seemed untouchable. As the leader of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, he commanded the devotion of over 25,000 members. His sermons reached far beyond the church walls, touching politicians, athletes, and entertainers who came to seek his blessing. To many, he was more than a pastor. He was a symbol of strength and spiritual power. But behind that powerful image, unseen by most, a different story was quietly unfolding. Years after his passing, Vanessa Long finally opened her heart to reveal what really happened in those final hidden moments. She did not speak from a grand stage or a press event. Instead, her words surfaced quietly, shared in private conversations and personal reflections that have now come to light. What she revealed was not the story the public had been told. Instead, it was a painful tale of sickness, shame, betrayal, and silence. It began with whispers. In 2016, rumors started spreading that Bishop Long's health was failing. Church members, who had always seen him as strong and bold, were shocked by photos of him looking thin, his once powerful frame now fragile. When asked, Bishop Long explained that he had chosen a raw vegan diet and was focused on healthy living. It sounded believable at first, but those closest to him knew that was not the whole truth. Privately, he was battling an aggressive form of cancer, something he chose to keep hidden from the world. According to Vanessa, he hid it not because he wanted to deceive, but because he feared what people would say. He worried that showing weakness would not only hurt his reputation, but would also damage the faith of those who looked up to him. More than anything, he did not want his illness to become another weapon for his critics. But the choice to keep silent came with a painful cost. As his strength faded, so did the circle of people around him. Friends who had once called daily now stopped picking up the phone. Church leaders who had stood by his side in the spotlight were suddenly too busy to visit. Even some staff members who had been like family began to keep their distance. To Vanessa, it felt as if people were ashamed of him. The same people who had once cheered his sermons and praised his leadership quietly turned away. In those lonely months, Bishop Long's world grew smaller. Meetings he had once led were now held without him. Decisions about church finances and leadership were discussed in rooms where he was no longer welcome. Vanessa later discovered documents showing that plans were already in motion for what would happen after he died. Even though he was still alive and still fighting for his life, it was as if the people he had trusted the most had decided his story was over before it truly ended. But the pain did not stop with illness and silence. In 2010, years before his health crisis, Bishop Long had faced accusations that would forever change how people saw him. 4 young men, once close to him as spiritual sons and mentees, accused him of using his position to pressure them into sexual relationships. These were not distant strangers, but people who had been part of the church family. They said he had offered them gifts, trips, and mentorship, while allegedly crossing a line behind closed doors. The news broke like a storm, shaking the faith of thousands who had believed in him. Rather than fight the accusations in court, Bishop Long chose to settle privately in 2011. There was no public apology, no admission of guilt, and the details remained sealed. But the damage to his reputation could not be hidden. Church attendance fell, other pastors who had once called him brother stepped back. And even among those who stayed, an uncomfortable silence hung in the air. Inside, he was fighting battles no one could see. As the years passed, The energy and power that once defined him began to fade. His sermons grew shorter, his public appearances less frequent. Yet even as his health failed, the one thing that hurt most was the loneliness. Vanessa described nights where he would sit quietly, looking at old photos and remembering the crowds who once cheered for him. In those moments, the man who had inspired so many was just a husband, afraid of being forgotten. Vanessa herself felt the weight of these secrets. She stayed silent for years, even as she watched the church quietly plan its future without him. Documents she found showed meetings held behind his back, discussions of succession, and financial decisions he had never approved. These were not just plans for a future after his death, but signs that some leaders had already let go of him while he was still breathing. One of the most painful parts of her story came when she admitted there was a moment she almost walked away too. Not because she stopped loving him, but because the pain of betrayal was too heavy. Yet she stayed, because she knew he had no one else left. In those final days, when his voice was too weak to preach and his body too frail to stand, he turned to Vanessa with one request: don't let them rewrite my story. His dying wish was not about money or power, it was about truth. He wanted people to remember more than the scandal. He wanted them to see the man who had once believed deeply, who had tried to help others, who had built something he thought would last beyond him. Not only about the accusations, but about losing sight of the mission that had once been so clear to him. He confessed to her quietly, "I built a house for God, but somewhere along the way, I stopped checking who was living in it." These words haunted Vanessa because they showed he still cared, even as he faced his end. His final weeks were marked by a sad kind of silence. Once, he would have been surrounded by music, prayer, and the voices of thousands. Instead, he lay in a quiet room, his wife by his side. As the world outside continued on, friends he had once mentored stayed away. Church elders he had trusted no longer called. Even national faith leaders who had once shared stages with him disappeared. To outsiders, it might have seemed respectful, as if they were giving him space. But Vanessa saw it differently. She believed it was fear of being connected to a dying man whose name had become tied to scandal. What had once been love and loyalty turned into careful distance. In private, they erased him long before he took his last breath. This was not the grand ending many imagined for such a powerful figure. There were no packed stadiums, no final sermon filled with thunderous applause. Instead, Bishop Long spent his last moments whispering regrets, held only by the woman who refused to leave. Even after his death, the story did not end. The church moved forward. Leaders filled the empty seats. The ministry that once celebrated him tried to find its next chapter. And still, the questions remained. What was true? What was hidden? And why did so many choose silence over honesty? Vanessa's choice to speak now, years later, was not to erase his mistakes. She admitted he had faults and that he struggled with choices that hurt others. His dying words, "Don't let them rewrite my story," were more than a plea for himself. They were a warning. In the world of faith, where churches grow large and pastors become celebrities, there is a danger. The brand becomes more important than the person. The mission becomes lost under the weight of power and reputation. And when things go wrong, the same people who once cheered may quietly disappear. Vanessa's voice is now the last piece of his story. In the end, Bishop Eddie Long did not ask to be remembered as a perfect man. He asked to be remembered as someone who tried, who failed, and who wished to make things right. He hoped people would see past the scandal and remember the lives he touched and the faith he once preached with passion. The story of He Was Left to Die Alone, Bishop Eddie Long's wife, finally tells all is haunting because it shows what can happen when power overshadows humanity. It is not just about one man, but about every ministry that forgets why it began. It shows how quickly crowds can become silent, and how easily loyalty can turn into quiet betrayal. As the years pass, many will forget the details. The photos of him looking frail will fade. The sermons that once moved thousands may be played less often, but through Vanessa's words, one truth remains. Even the strongest can find themselves alone in the end, and the real legacy is not built in the spotlight, but in what is left behind when the crowds go home. And who, in his last breath, wished not for praise, but for honesty. Vanessa kept her promise. She shared his regrets, his doubts, and his final moments, not to excuse him, but to show that behind every story of power and failure is a human being. In the end, Bishop Long's journey is both a tragedy and a lesson, a reminder that truth, even when painful, is worth telling. And so, through silence, suffering, and one woman's promise, the real story is finally heard. A story of faith, failure, and the search for redemption that did not end with applause, but with a whisper, "Don't let them rewrite my story."